being an educator, I find myself frequently depressed about what seems to me to be a change in education. When I went to college, I just went to see what college would have to offer. I would take my classes and get excited about things that I had never heard of before or thought of. And I developed a love of literature, a love of philosophy. There was all this fascinating stuff out there, right? And it wasn't aimed at, how will this get me a job that will get me promoted, that will get me to, right? It closes off the possibility. It doesn't even suggest to people, well, find something you're passionate about and then develop that. Or it doesn't ask you to be kind of self-exploratory. You think you know what you want and you go for it, and then it's not what you want. And that, I think, can create a crisis of meaning. So what I would like is to be able to turn the public discourse around from that and, kind of encourage people to step back and ask questions about what would make my life worth living earlier in the day and approach their opportunities in that spirit.
Let's just get into it. So we're continuing the Wolf series along with the class. And so today we're doing an episode on another paper of hers within morality and ethics and moral philosophy, and it's called Above and Below the Line of Duty, which was originally published, if my research is correct, in 1986. So,
I didn't know that.
Shortly after Moral Saints, right? Was Moral Saints 82? Is that what
she references Moral Saints in this? So yes, definitely after.
Yeah, that's right. And I definitely, once again, I'm seeing so far, I think the way that the instructors have ordered the readings has been excellent, because I'm seeing threads of all the previous essays in each of the subsequent essays so far. So it's kind of rewarding to catch those, Yeah,
totally.
Yeah. Okay, so I actually, because of the Steelers game, I actually don't have remember I started last episode with kind of a polished summary of the paper. I don't have that this time, but I do have notes that I use to compose those more polished things. So I can kind of go through that real quick and then we can just discuss it.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so in this paper, Wolf kind of points out that commonly the experience of conforming to duty, when we do conform to what we think is required of us, is that we don't want to do that thing intrinsically, but we kind of feel compelled to psychologically. So she's pointing to this pull that duty has in some sense. And when she's talking about moral duties, she is talking about a minimal standard of human decency beyond which the best of us may do willingly. So that kind of sets up this metaphor or visual aid that she uses throughout the paper. She talks about this line of duty. It's supposed to be this kind of hard stop below which you are morally forbidden from going. And as long as you meet those requirements, that's kind of what we think of as a morally decent person. And if you go above the line of duty, that's, supererogatory. You're doing things above and beyond what is required of you.
And I kind of take it that the line of duty in this case is sort of just a compilation of individual duties to do certain things or to not do certain things, right? That's my understanding of it, because it seems like that was my understanding kind of broadly halfway through, which was okay, there's this line of duty, but then she begins to get into duties of, duty to not lie, or a duty to commit to certain obligations or something like that, right? I mean, is that sort of how you guys are viewing this?
Yeah, she says explicitly, I think on page 200, that the contents of the moral theory, kind of being the instantiation of the duty, or what defines duty, is not really what's at play here. It's okay, given, and that kind of mirrored the social command theory paper. It was sort of given any moral theory you want to, duty implies that there's this line, and according to the contents, that will tell you what's below the line and above the line. But I was reading it the same way, Adam, that like, yeah. So basically, like, I maybe actually okay. Do you guys? This is like a question for you two, I guess. I can keep going, or I can kind of leave it set up with that, and then we can work through the rest. Or I can tell you, like, as quickly as I can how I was seeing the whole paper.
I mean, I'm kind of down to go either way. I mean, maybe you go, maybe you saying the entire outline might kind of help us
Okay.
identify exactly which area we want to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. So basically there's kind of four main sections to the paper. So here's how I'm seeing each section. Right. So in section 1, she says that duty arises because of these conjoined premises. One, we feel as though we are part of a moral world that we can shape in either a positive or a negative direction, but that we, like ourselves or our desires, are not identical to the world. Okay, so this kind of like implies a question of how much we do owe to the world. So she's kind of saying, like, it can't be everything or nothing intuitively. And so this seems to call out for a hard line, but any hard line we draw is going to be problematic for reasons that she talks about later. So actually, yeah, let's just dive into what page. Oh, and there's so there's also, let's dive into that in a second, but there were also like a couple more like table setting things. So the general layout of the paper is she kind of has like two criticisms, right? She says that she's going to criticize the idea of duty being identified with a set of rules, kind of like above which you can go, below which you must not go, right? And that's what Adam was talking about. But then she's also going to criticize duty as being the minimum standard of moral decency. So she's like critiquing the place of morality in our lives, and that's kind of where the paper ends with more. So okay, yeah. So okay, section 1. I kind of told you how I'm seeing what she's doing there, and she says, like, I don't know if I know exactly why she thinks this, but she said that, like, exploring why we even feel impelled to conform with duty will be part of her reasons for critiquing it. So this is on like page 201, and she says that yeah, let me read this actually. Okay, so this is 201, one sentence into the first paragraph. She says, sometimes according to this view, it will not be sufficient for moral decency that one acts in accordance with duty, and sometimes a morally decent person will violate his or her duty even without a morally compelling reason to do so. If this is right, then it's being one's duty, even one's all things considered duty, to do something does not automatically imply that, all things considered, one should do it. That is, it does not automatically imply that one has decisive reason to do it. So she's kind of saying, like, she's decoupling the idea. Now, that's not like an argument. That's more of like a summary quote, I think. But she's kind of saying, like, okay, she wants to uncouple like moral decency from always adhering to duty. Like, she's gonna go on in the paper to bring up like examples of when you could do the decent thing but not conform with duty. Right?
Yeah. And I like the examples like she does bring up too, where, like, if we would kind of just jump into some of her examples, where
yes,
like, why not choose one of her examples, just to kind of like illustrate the point she just brings up. I mean, yeah. I liked the one where she said, like, okay, so, a philosopher, so it's like, okay, so a hero or a heroine in this case of a philosopher is like going to be in town, during these hours, and will be delivering a lecture. But at that same time, the professor or the philosopher in this case has a commitment to their office hours. And so they have a duty to commit to, be with their students, and because they just like have a general duty to commitment.
Mhm.
So, but she also says that it would be reasonable for that same philosopher to actually want to go like listen to that lecture and maybe forego one's duty. So in this case right here, it's saying that if we read like that one sentence again that you just read, so let's see. Then it's being one's duty, even if one's all things considered duty to do something does not automatically imply that all things considered one should do it. So it's like in that case, one has like a clear duty to commit to one's kind of
to like honor your
pre-planned
promises.
obligations. Yeah. And it's but in this case, like there's like a reasonable gain to going to like this, you know, hero's lecture in this sense. So
yeah, and it's like I think she would also resist the idea, because I don't remember what page she talks about this, but she also talks about like there's kind of a way you could wiggle out of this, right? Which is like something I know you and I have talked about before, where it's like, well, maybe you could kind of like jigger things such that like the pleasure that you would get out of attending the conference would like outweigh the negative affect that you would induce in like the people who miss your office hours or whatever. But she's like, but take that aside, because obviously sometimes that's not going to be the case. Like you don't and you especially couldn't know that in advance. Like you don't know how many people are going to show up to your office hours or not. So yeah, so there's like, so this is a, and I think she brought this forth as an example where you're violating some duty, but it's kind of a trivial duty and you're doing it for like some personal reasons, and it's kind of not like a huge deal to you, so the stakes are kind of low. And she like concludes by saying that her point with that example is that even though that agent has a duty to act one way, and even though there is no conflicting duty and no great good to the world pulling that person to act another way, it is not necessarily the case that if that's a decent human being, then they will have decisive reason to do as duty commands. So she's like, I don't know, she's like kind of just like putting a wedge in between like what duty requires you and what it's like morally decent for you to do permissibly. Right. I mean, that's kind of that's how I was tending to read it. Because she's like, okay, so circling back to section 1, because okay, you know what, I actually, okay, I think it just clicked for me a little bit like why she talks about why we even have the concept of duty, because she's basically trying to say like, okay, because like one of her claims is to like deflate the importance of duty in our lives, right? Maybe not deflate, but she's trying to be like, okay, it's not everything. Right. And so, okay, so like part of her critique is going to be like, well, what duty gets us or something like that is going to be less. It's not going to hold up to the promise of like what duty puts itself forth as. Right. So then it like, okay, she's trying to answer the question of like, what does duty like portend to like give us? Right. Yeah. And so I don't know, like this argument from her made a lot of sense to me, because she basically just says like, okay, and like I buy this. Like these two things seem like super reasonable to me, because she's basically saying like the idea of duty arises because, okay, so like we're part of a moral world, right? Like in some small way we can shape the world in either a positive or negative direction, but at the same time, like we are not identical to the world, such that our desires or like our aims in life are going to be decoupled from what's best for the world in some sense. So like that in like a very kind of like rudimentary way, which I liked, like poses the question of like the question of duty, essentially, like how much do we owe, or like what do we owe? And in like the Wolf style, I mean, I think she dismisses kind of quickly the idea that it can't be like we don't owe everything to the world, but we also don't owe anything to the world.
Yeah, and you also just like can't quantify exactly how much you owe to the world either. I mean, I think we could almost like skip that whole section, because it's just like, I mean, I was like by line 1, I mean, I was pretty thoroughly convinced that,
Yeah.
you know, you can't identify that we owe, you know, 1/10 of our time.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah, that was
Tuesdays.
straightforward.
Yeah, or we
Yeah.
can't forego 1/10 of our interests, or, you know what I mean? It's just like none of
Yes.
that makes any logical sense. It's like, it's not really a quantifiable thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
If duty is supposed to have utility, it's not going to be using some sort of impossible metric.
Yeah, and like she says that like duty kind of like calls out for a hard line definition. Like that's almost like, I mean, it's kind of true. Like when you ask like even like non-philosophical people like what a duty is, like the idea is that it's something that's like non-negotiable, right?
Yeah.
It's like something that you have to do. So it does imply like a hard line. But then, yeah, as you guys just said, she like, you know, like defining what the hard line would be is actually kind of difficult as soon as you begin to dig into it. Okay, so I think that gets us to section 2, right? So the task that she does in section 2 is that so now we're at the point where like there's a challenge, and that challenge is to find a line of duty that is generally good and individually possible. So she's like kind of set us up for this challenge, right? Like, okay, well, it seems like we want to have the concept of duty. It can't be everything, it can't be nothing. So it's got to be like plausible for an individual to actually conform with. But then she says like you can't reasonably kind of divide your life into sections like that. So just trying to find the sections that I thought were interesting.
Yeah, because like she kind of opens like section 2 almost like just addressing the absurdity of drawing a hard line, like because it's like, okay, yeah, a duty does call out for a hard line, but like how are you going to draw it? And it's like she kind of proposes different ways that people have proposed drawing that hard line, and it's like I kind of agree none of those hold up. So
no, you're right. Section 2 is a little bit of like a continuation of section 1.
So like the bottom of 205 I think introduces something. I made a note. She says, I don't have a theory of duty, and I was a little disappointed at that. I feel like there's always like some little thing. I mean, I should have known, obviously, because it's like a very short paper. But I'm going for from 205 into 206.
Yeah.
Wait,
on that note though, Giff, like I don't know. I was just like, I don't think I've ever read someone who, and I was so curious if you like just in the history of like, you know, us doing the show or whatever, like have we, I don't think I've really ever read like a paper that like Wolf has this like very kind of like disarming ability to be like, I don't know, because usually like when you hear, I don't know, I like almost any philosophy paper I read, it's like, okay, when you're like critiquing this idea, it's not logically required, obviously, but like it is like common practice to, you don't have to argue for like your solution in the paper, but you usually kind of motion towards like, you know, this is kind of like the framework of a solution or whatever. But like Wolf doesn't do that in a way that like doesn't betray my expectations somehow, paradoxically. Like, I don't know. I was just curious if you guys had that experience reading this too.
This one in particular, I kind of want to discuss the conclusion a little bit. Just because you know, when reading through it, there were pieces of how she might address this, right? It's not that she has like any theory of duty per se, but she does hint at things, right? I mean, so it's like, I do want to kind of play with those a little bit of how she kind of attempts to address this, but
sorry, Giffen, what were you going to say? The bottom of 205.
Oh, yeah. I guess she introduces here. Sorry, but we were.
You're about to like confabulate some thought that you had been like. You're like, well, yes, of course, I've been thinking of it.
Naturally. No. So at the bottom of 205, she kind of like,
and this isn't ad hoc. Sorry.
She kind of invokes. I think this is the first time she mentions it, but like common sense morality. And that kind of like, at that point, I kind of made a note of like, I think she's kind of like simultaneously like discussing like the concept of duty and like trying to establish like the set of desired parameters of duty. Like that's kind of like the main point of the paper. But I don't know if you guys felt this way, but like I think there were a few times in the paper, either like in an example, just like there's a feeling like that it her conclusion maybe was like rubbing against my intuition. So I'm just like, it made me wonder like to what extent like her kind of like either implied assumptions might like not necessarily be common sense morality. Like
Well,
it seems
I think
like
Well, I think with the common sense morality part right there, I think she was just like giving us an idea of like, okay, well, what does common sense morality say? Right? Because like she said, like this would work like pretty much with any moral framework, like the same sort of assessment of what different duties would look like. But I think she's saying like under common sense morality, duties would, have us not lie, cheat, or steal,
Yeah.
keep our promises, those kind of things. Because it's like there might be other duties depending on the moral framework that one adopts, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And I think like part of her goal here is also she's trying to also show that like, I mean, I don't think she's ever explicit about this, but she seems to be showing that like our common sense ideas about this do conflict with each other. Like there is some weird way in which like they're not totally aligning, right?
That's kind of what I'm getting at. And I don't know. I think I would have I can't really imagine like what responses there are to this paper, but I think I would have liked it a little bit like better if like there was a little bit more discussion on like, because I don't know, I just get the impression that she kind of like takes like our intuitions and are like, we kind of need to like legitimize these instead of like critiquing them, if that makes sense. The very soft kind of gut feeling I had going through this paper. I don't know if like that was just kind of on me.
No, it's
you guys
definitely
kind of felt the same way.
No, I mean, like I think we've been seeing throughout the series that like the role that intuitions play in Wolf's philosophy is definitely stronger than a lot of at least like moral theory that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would be getting at. And I don't know, maybe it's just not my like preference, but like I all of the papers I thought like were interesting and useful, and like they promote a conversation about these different concepts that are useful or proposes concepts. But I just can't like shake the little feeling. I'm like, I wish we could kind of discuss like some of the, I guess, priors or like the assumptions built in here,
Yeah,
a little bit more.
And I'm not really sure. Like, so again, I don't know Wolf's work, but I don't think that she has like a paper called "The Role of Intuitions in My Philosophical Thinking." You know what I mean? Like
that would be phenomenal.
That would be a really interesting paper to like dig into. And I like, for all I know, maybe that does exist. I just don't think it does. You know what I mean? So,
but it's definitely a through line we can notice. So I just wanted to point that out because like that was like at the bottom of 205 was where I kind of like made that observation and thought it would be worth bringing up.
Yeah, no. So, okay, Giffen, like, what do you think about this? I'm just trying to like get your idea kind of like developed a little bit more.
Sure.
Because I agree. I think it's like a good one. Okay, so like we talked about this, maybe it was two episodes ago with the Moral Saints one, but remember I told you about like Peter Singer's shallow pond argument, right?
Yeah.
So like the upshot of that argument is essentially that like we're kind of monsters for like always violating this do you need me to run through it real quick?
Huh?
Do you need me to run through it real quick?
The what?
Like the argument from Singer?
Oh, I mean, sure, yeah.
Oh, okay. I saw this like flash of the computer screen at your glasses, and I was like, well, I could just run through it real quick if you were looking it up. No, he basically like, remember, it's the idea that like, okay, if you walked past like the child drowning in the shallow pond and you didn't step in because you were like, you didn't want to ruin your $500 shoes, like you'd be a monster, right?
Yeah.
But you have the opportunity to save that child every day by just either selling your shoes or not buying new shoes and just like giving the 500 to Oxfam or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
Like that would reasonably save a life or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So like, okay. So I think Wolf, okay. So the idea there is that like, we have a duty on like a consequentialist basis to like give everything we possibly can. Right. And like Singer uses our own intuitions to do that. I feel like from reading this paper, Wolf is going to respond to that by saying like, it's not that the argument is wrong or flawed, but it's that like, we couldn't, it's like I feel like she would say something along the lines of like, but that's too absurd a conclusion to accept. Right. And she's like,
fair. She wants to build, from what I kind of like gather, she wants to build like concepts and like structures and like institutions and ways of thinking around very, very practical kind
Yeah.
of conceptions rather than like ideals. And I
Yeah.
think part of that like just rubs against my previous kind of like intuition
Oh,
about like
yeah.
morality.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think she
Yeah, no,
even
I
addresses
agree.
that previously of moral saints. Like that's kind of the whole point. She starts out with it, right? Like
Mm.
I don't want me or any of my friends to be morally perfect. So
Mhm.
that's bold. But I think that just is going to continue to like kind of challenge my intuition throughout all of these. I think because like I think like honestly, this one is pretty much grounded in that notion. Because otherwise, like her conception of duty doesn't make sense unless you grant like that framework. Which
well, grant what? Wait. I'm just like grant what framework? Because she defines.
But, sorry. Go ahead.
She defines duty like just in general as like this idea that there's like a minimum standard, below which like you ought not go, and above which like it's like supererogatory to go.
Right.
So, but like I guess I thought that idea of duty was like kind of like accepted by everyone, in the sense that like that is kind of like the common sense idea of duty, right?
Yeah, I guess like a duty, but like in the context of like a moral duty, it just seems to me that like I don't know. I think I viewed it as like there is simple morality, and then there's failing to achieve it. So like the concept of like the duty in this case is one particularly relevant only if like you kind of have a framework where like you just perfect morality is impossible, so you kind of have to like develop a system of living within that reality. If that makes sense.
System of living within that morality.
And also, I feel like there's like a bit of like a deconstruction of like that more simple concept of like duty in this paper, where I mean, I could be wrong, but I really feel like she does state in a few areas that like the benefit to the world and like the benefit to one individual or like oneself, like they're kind of on two different axes. Like they're not like you can't really equate them directly. Right.
Yes.
So it's not that there isn't like a concept of individual benefit or how much individual benefit. It's not that there isn't like it's not that you couldn't measure like the benefit to the world. It's that it's like they're not really like comparable. There's not really any sort of ratio one could apply. I mean, it's kind of up in the air to say that, okay, I mean, which I think also like brings out like a lot of problems as well, like which not problems with her own construction there, because I think they're good points on her part, that they're not exactly like commensurable, but at the same time it's like I don't know, we'll have to get into her concept of duty, but I'm not really sure what duty one could have to the world over oneself if they're not really commensurable. You can't compare benefits one to the other.
And like, okay.
So she's, in my view, at least, she seems to be saying like, we don't really view it that way. And this is what I was talking about before, where it's kind of like just kind of like legitimizing our intuitions. So it's like, okay, given that we don't really like have that common sense framework currently, it's like we, and develop around that. Whereas opposed like to what might be a discussion about that intuition.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Wait, so okay.
I mean, like, how about like that 10,000 if you get back, right? Like, what could that 10,000 do like abroad?
Yeah, right? It could save lives. It could save many lives.
Like, what if we knew perfectly what it could do? Like, she even brings this up. Like, it's not really like a lack of knowledge. That's not really the point. You know what I mean? Because you could know perfectly what it would do for the world and what it would do for yourself. And it's like, say you find out that like saves 20 lives as opposed to, provides real material comfort to you, security. And it's like, okay, how do you even like measure those things? You know what I mean? Like, how do you compare those
You're
things?
Totally right. Because she says like, okay, the main question here is not an epistemic one, because it's like, once you find that out, you still have like, you haven't solved anything. Like it's well, how many lives does it really save or whatever, and like and then she just says like, okay, but just like we just know that it's going to save 19 lives, and then on the other hand, like we know how much it's going to do for like my like financial security or whatever. It's like we haven't answered anything at that point.
Exactly. It doesn't tell you one way or the other still.
Exactly. So, wait, okay. This was based on something you both have said. So I took her in this paper to be not okay. I didn't take her in this paper to be trying to reform the concept of duty as much as I took her to be reforming like the so part one, she does say that she wants to criticize the idea of duty being identified with a set of rules. So maybe that's
Yeah.
where
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe that's where she's criticizing like the concept of duty, but then she also says an aim of hers is criticizing the idea that duty like criticizing the place that duty plays in our lives, or like the role it fills in our lives. But I take it that that's only a criticism if you have her unreformed idea of duty, right?
Yes, she actually specifies that, I think. Like,
Oh, maybe I missed
after
that.
she
Okay.
introduces the concept of like the reformed and unreformed, she subsequently will say, like, in her discussion and conclusion at the end,
Mm.
she'll like, you know,
Mm.
use parentheses and say like unreformed, or I think that's the phrase.
Mhm.
She does like at least mention that. I think Adam, you were alluding to that before, where she does kind of like propose some notion of like a resolution,
Yeah. Okay.
but
good.
No,
still
but-
wants to
but I
discuss
don't-
like
I
the
don't-
unresolved.
I don't think that's like that one. We can get into that one, but I don't think
Mm.
that's a proposition of hers. That's like someone else has kind of made that conception of duty, has like modified that conception.
Are you
And then
talking
she
about the
go-
amended duty?
Amended.
Correct. The amended duty is
That's
pretty
not.
much
'Cause
like
she still
okay,
disavows that too. right?
exactly.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
not
yeah.
hers.
Yeah.
So
okay.
so with that one, just like for the audience's sake or whoever's listening.
I have the quote if you want me to.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
a great quote.
Yeah, sure. Go
Okay.
down.
Okay, so she says, this is on 208 around the top, right at the end of section 3. She says, occasions may arise when it would be better for the world if a person did not do her duty, but we may avoid this paradoxical consequence by altering our definition of duty. Take the definition just given as a definition of prima facie duty. One's real duty may now be disjunctively defined. Either do one's prima facie duty or do something that is even better for the world. So she's like refined this idea because like before she gave some counter examples or whatever to the idea that like, you know, you must always do your duty, even when violating it, even if it's a minor duty, would create like better consequences. And I think those are pretty easy. Like, I think all of us would pretty much agree on those examples, right? Like they were pretty straightforward.
Yeah, like you think for 1 second, it's like, do you have like a duty to run into a burning home? Like, no,
Yeah.
like you don't have a duty to do that. So, you know,
And she says, if you had a conflicting duty, you know, like you promised your friend you would pick them up from the airport, she's like, it would be absurd to conclude that you don't run into the burning building because you're fulfilling your other duty. Right? Like that.
Yeah.
Like
No, I think that was a completely fair critique.
Yeah,
I didn't have a question with that.
I liked that. Yeah.
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 The only thing that I will say is that like whenever she was discussing like the this is related to like I guess the rules at this point. But when she was discussing like the philosopher and like the office hours example, I just thought like she was kind of using a notion of duty that was I think was kind of like straightforward, like little basic. Like I think that like, you know, because in this case like the duty was like, you know, I have obligations to, you know, keep my promise, I guess, towards like, you know, I made a commitment. But I just thought like, I don't know, even like my intuitions, I guess, to stay on that framework, kind of, I think are already a little bit more nuanced than that. Like, I don't think that most people would say like, you know, straightforwardly, like my duty in that sense is to, you know, do this basic thing. Right. So I just thought it was kind of a weak form of duty, which I guess she discusses this with like the reformed notion as well. But I just thought like she could have given stronger examples of like more elaborate or complex duty that might resolve in some of the cases that she gave. I don't know. Did you guys get that impression?
Did you have like more of like a utilitarian kind of view of duty, which is just like to kind of bring about the most good for the most people?
Something like
or
that.
the most
Yeah.
happiness.
As opposed to like, yeah. So this
So
is
however you
know-
define good.
Mm.
So
Huh?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I missed your question. I'm sorry.
He just said, however you define the good.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter what it's
Yeah.
happiness or whatever. So
Yeah. No, I think that's probably fair. Closer to like my intuitions.
Yeah. So, okay.
It's like I agree with the critique of the rules, but
Mhm.
I don't know. Like if that like she seems to like need some sort of like to keep the concept of duty here. There needs to be some kind of rule-ish thing, right?
But it's like I think all the critiques still stand though on her part though. You know what I mean? Like because you could have a more sophisticated like sense of duty where it's just like, okay, I have, you know, a duty to bring about the most good for the most people. Like just keep it real general.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's like, okay, well, you'll still take like a different, or you still did make a different decision like often. And it's like, okay, if you flout that sense of duty, are you like morally deficient? Are you like now below that basic kind of moral line of decency? Like, and I think the intuitions no, right?
Yeah.
So because it's a common thing we do. So
and like Giffen, I think you were picking up on something that I noticed too. And Wolf was like, I don't even think that I'm not even sure that she would agree with maybe phrasing it like this, but it kind of seemed like what she was doing, where like in the beginning of the paper more, she almost seemed to be like kind of tackling this like amalgamation of like Kantianism and utilitarianism of some sort. And she kind of tackled it like in ways that I thought were a little bit more like defeating to someone who had like a really like Kantian notion of duty, right? Like, but like then, you know, like I think Adam introduced like where she's right about to get to in section 4, right? Like even if you do have like a kind of strict like broad consequentialist view of duty, she kind of raises this challenge for that too. So I love the way listen to this quote too. I didn't have this highlighted, but it just caught my eye. So on 208 she says, as in the previous discussion, I cannot prove my point absolutely. I can only present some general considerations that should make the point seem likely and try to reinforce the point with some examples. So she's like, it's kind of, I don't know, part of me appreciates her like showing her cards in some sense of being like, no, this isn't like, you know, I'm not going to give you some proof. You know what I mean? Like, this is not going to be a proof of any sort. But at the same time, like, I'm not just like bullshitting here either, which I don't know. I kind of get the idea that a lot of philosophy is more like this, but more dressed up in a lot of ways. I don't know. I get that. I have that like feeling or whatever. Okay.
Yeah. And just to kind of bring up what you just said real fast about
how she writes.
Not that specifically, but it was right before that where you brought up like how she tries to like kind of address like how a utilitarian might address some of her criticisms, which is that like a utilitarian might say, well, like, okay, you could flout one's duty for individual benefits because the individual is part of the world. And, you know, if like the benefit to the individual as part of the world just increases the overall happiness, or however a utilitarian might define it, then that would still be like, you know, a kind of reasonable flouting of one's duty at that point, and what you wouldn't drop beneath the line of moral decency, that hard line. So
and I think that she would say to like that potential criticism, she doesn't say this, but I think she would say like, well, but I'm going to raise some examples where like that calculus doesn't work out, but we still think it's reasonable to you know, flout, you know, something, not because it actually does work out on that utility calculus, but just because like this kind of goes back to her plurality of values or whatever, but just like because it's important to you in some sense, like it's not unreasonable to do that.
I think we're starting to get to the point where like I have serious questions about the paper.
Okay, nice.
Because like I definitely think that, so we're getting to the point where she brings up the examples you just mentioned to kind of differentiate between like what's moral and what's reasonable.
Yes.
So she does make that distinction, and I think that she does like a good job in kind of obviously like differentiating those two concepts. But I think my problem is like, let's get into the two examples she brought up, because I'm okay. Well, yeah, let's just get into those.
Yeah. Can I? So, okay, there was something that I wanted to like raise as we get into the two examples, because it seems like the reason why she's bringing them up is to like prove this point.
Yeah.
So she says, okay, so there's
What
this,
page?
so there's a really important quote on 209.
Yeah.
This is the last the last few sentences before the last paragraph. Okay, so she says like and I won't go through, there's like a more formalized version of this, but we don't have to go through that for the podcast. She says like, okay, but if it is reasonable for a person to fail to do a required but trivial good in order to do a great but not required good for the world. Okay, so that's the first kind of thing. So I buy that, right? So I buy that there are instances in which it's reasonable for someone to fail to do something that's trivial but a duty in order to create like a great good that was not duty bound. That meshes with my intuitions, right?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Okay. Continuing at the sentence, and it is reasonable for a person to fail to do a great but not required good for the world in order to do what is of considerable importance to himself. So that's the second thing that you buy. And I also buy that, right? So failing to do something great but not required in order to do what is of considerable importance to yourself. That's basically what we were just talking about, like the moral saints episode, which I kind of buy. Like I would call that reasonable. Giffen?
I'm soft on it, but we'll grant it for now.
That's yeah, that's right. You're soft on it because you and Adam had different responses to my driving the BMW example.
Yeah,
because you said you like condemned it, but very, very softly, whereas Adam said more of, he just found it pretty reasonable. Like he's not. Yes,
a lot is hinging on that reasonable. Like, I do find it reasonable, but like.
Yeah,
there's some implications in that reasonable, right?
Okay.
Like it related to her framing of like a morally decent person, I think in this case is what reasonable would be talking about. Yeah. Anyways, continue.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so then she concludes, how can it be unreasonable for a person to fail to do a required but trivial good in order to do what is of considerable importance to himself, which seems to follow. She kind of did like a transitive, property there. So it's like, So, and that like both seems to follow logically. And I also I don't like feel like I intuitively object to that. Like it's not unreasonable for a person to fail to do a required but trivial good in order to do what is of considerable importance to himself. We do that all the time.
Yeah.
Like, and no one blinks an eye at it.
Yeah.
So there's one reply that she talks about, which I think that this would be the response that you're most amenable to, Giffen, which is kind of like the biting the bullet and just saying like, it's just logically in a position where like it's basically the next paragraph. I don't know. Was that like was that kind of the direction you went with it?
I need to reread this actually before I comment because
okay, let me read it for myself too then. Okay, so she says it's open to someone to just reply, it just can. And it's true, it can. There is nothing logically wrong with the position that is reasonable for a decent man to violate his unamended duty in order to perform a greater good for the world, but that it is not unreasonable for a decent man to violate his unamended duty in order to perform a good for himself. Our symbolic greater than sign has not been shown to be a transitive relation, which is what I read it as. So she's saying that there's nothing logically wrong with that response, but she still thinks that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And that's why she brings up the examples. One of which Adam said, I actually really liked the second one too, of like the prying mother.
Yes. Yeah, that was good too.
I really got, so, okay. Basically, the example is like, imagine you've just gotten into like a huge fight with your partner, like a potentially like relationship ending one, and he's checked into a hotel for a few nights to kind of like cool off and think things over. But you were like scheduled to go over to your mother's house for dinner that night. And you just, so going to the dinner is obviously impossible. That's not even an option. But secondly, you also are like not really comfortable like sharing the details of why you can't come to the dinner with your mother tonight. So you just make up this like small lie. You're like, well, we have tickets to the opera. I forgot. I'm sorry. Like we won't be able to attend. Which is like a situation we've all been in like some form or another, right?
Of course.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And she says that it strikes her as like, totally reasonable that you would, so that's a situation in which like you violate a small duty, namely not to lie to someone. And you do that not necessarily because it's like consequentially a better outcome. It's just one that is like, for lack of a better word, like it's like simpler. It's just more like, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, it's because like you could imagine if you were a moral saint, like you could like have that conversation with your mother about like how you can't because like you got into a fight or whatever, and like all this, and like that could be like, you know, who knows, like let's say that that's the better, for whatever reason, like consequentialist outcome. She's still saying like, okay, it was just like reasonable on some level, like we just have the intuition that it's reasonable to like make a small lie, right?
Yeah.
And she goes even further, because I mean, she said like, what if you had perfect knowledge once again of like the situation, and you knew that, you know, say lying in that circumstance wouldn't bring about just like you know, a better general effect to the world.
Yeah.
And
she
it's
says
like,
still like you just
still,
don't want to
yeah.
have that conversation, like, and that's fine. You just don't want to have it. Yeah. No, you're right. Okay, so and then the other example was the one that you gave about office hours. So she says, okay, my point, so this is in the paragraph after the examples on 210. She says, so okay, my point is that even though these agents have a duty to act one way, and even though there is no conflicting duty and no great good to the world pulling them to act together, or, I'm sorry, pulling them to act another, it is not necessarily the case that if they are decent human beings, they will have decisive reason to do as duty commands. Was this getting into, what was the area that you had the biggest kind of like issues with, Adam?
I guess like just kind of the concept of like reasonableness here, and like what this implies here.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's just like, I mean, I haven't given this enough thought, but it just seemed to me whenever I read through this, I'm like, okay, well, it actually might be reasonable a lot of the time in maybe areas we'd be unhappy about to pull out one's duty to the world as a whole. And it's like, we don't know exactly where that line is, but like, I don't know. I mean, like, let me think of maybe like a trickier example. I don't know. It's like, okay, what if we define like myself? I don't know. I kind of liked her taxes example, actually. Maybe let's dive into that one a little bit, where it's like, okay, what if I,
where is that?
What if I cheat on my taxes and as a result, like I save like $30,000,
Yeah.
right? Like that is like sending in my $30,000 like to like the federal government. That is like a trivial kind of like good to the world, right? But what if I intend to, I don't know, what's something reasonable I could do with the $30,000?
That is also not obviously morally better, right? That's what you're trying to create the example of right now.
Yes.
Okay.
So
if you just like
3-person trip to Vegas.
No, because
because that's like heinous.
Yeah, exactly. But like,
what if you used it to like use it for a down payment on like your daughter's house or whatever? Like, sure.
It's like I am certainly helping someone a lot, right? But it's
not obviously better on like a
not obviously better. Exactly. So it's like it might actually be very reasonable, like depending on like the circumstances of you know, perhaps like it's like their first home, like they're doing financially poorly, but this $30,000 like would make a serious difference in their lives. I don't know. I
realized there's, okay, so like you guys know, we talked about this off air, but you remember that stupid like personality test or whatever, and like I was like chaotic neutral.
So,
like
the alignment chart.
So I'm like, I feel like temperamentally I am very amenable to this idea that Adam's floating. And like, okay, I realized I do this all the time, and I'm just thinking of examples here, and I'm like willing to say them on air, like obviously because I don't think they're that, like I think they're reasonable to do. Okay, so like here's an example, like so I violate often. I do this, like this small moral duty. So sometimes I'll see like a conference call for papers or whatever, and it'll be like, um only like this is open to graduate students, but only graduate students who are in a PhD program. I fucking send the paper anyway. Like,
Yeah.
right? Because if they accept me and then they catch like, oh shit, he's only in an MA program, like I'll just be like, okay, but you guys obviously thought the paper was like got on its merits or whatever, right? Like I like, and that's, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So
It's very trivial, but it's a little deceptive, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's, like the good to the conference as a whole, like if your paper gets accepted, and the good to you, like actually maybe even just like,
well,
because you don't really have like a duty to the conference, or
I have like a duty to like people, I guess, like not to misrepresent myself.
Yeah. So I don't know.
Okay, wait, how about this? Okay, does your intuition change? So, okay, right now, do you both think that's reasonable? I know, Adam, you probably do, right?
Yeah, that doesn't bother me.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me either.
Okay.
Yeah.
What doesn't bother you? So you think it's reasonable, right? I'm just trying to think this through.
I think it's reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. So what if we stipulate that so I get accepted over someone else, obviously, but let's actually stipulate that everything would be better off if that person who I got accepted over actually presented. For whatever reason, their presentation would have gone better at the conference, and like they needed that conference on their CV to do something more than I did on mine. Okay,
Sure.
like with that being stipulated.
Oh God! I mean, that starts to like really like shift the balance a little bit, right?
No, it's, yeah, no, 100%. I think that just points to
Yeah.
the fact that like I think my conception of duty is more in line with those kind of like consequentialist. If given granted practical things like maybe it's not like do the best you can, or maybe it's more like do the best you can with like limited knowledge and things like that. But I mean, I just don't think I was going to say the reason that I thought it was reasonable in like the first instance was because I just don't really see like a strong moral duty in like the they had like a framework they wanted to have applicants conform to. It's like, okay, well, worst case scenario, like they notice and kick you off, or best case, they don't care actually. I don't see a strong moral duty there.
Well, it's so I kind of do think it is like a moral duty, but it's just like a very, very light one. Like, I think, like,
I agree with that. I agree.
Yeah, like, what about in general, the idea that just like as a general rule, you shouldn't deceive people in any way, right? Like that seems pretty plausible from my perspective.
Yeah, and like, and again, you just have to distinguish here between like the duty to not deceive and like the outcomes if he does, right? Because like in this case, like you're saying the outcome if he gets accepted is like there's such a marginal difference between like him applying to it and not applying to it in terms of like the general kind of goodness that he provides to the world or doesn't. So it's kind of like this is kind of a good test case in that sense, where it's like this would certainly be in that class of kind of trivial good. So yeah.
So Giffen, if I'm understanding like the brunt of your objection here, like, are you pointing to? I'm trying to figure out like what, because I kind of feel like the force of your objections, but I'm trying to like precisify it.
I don't know how precisified I can make it, but there's like I guess there's some intuitive non-meshing with her conception and the relationship between like duty, a morally decent person, and like rules related to duty. There's like something in like those relationships that just doesn't really map onto my intuitions.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of like, again, that's not precisified at all, but
okay, so are you it seems like you're kind of pushing back more against, because remember she kind of had the two aims, right? Like to show that like
rules is the first one, correct?
Well, rules makes it sound too like explicitly Kantian, but she was, oh no, you're right. she wants to critique the idea that duty is identified with a set of rules, and,
Yeah,
and
strictly,
those
yeah.
rules can be like grounded in like Kantian philosophy or consequentialist or like whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then she also had the idea to critique that duty is a minimum standard for moral decency. So like which one are you kind of like more against there?
I honestly like it's unclear.
Because to be honest, like, can I ask you guys, like, Adam,
Yeah.
you seem to, so okay, so there was like there's like the common sense idea of duty, which is like something that you like cannot fail to do, right? Then there was her amended sense of duty, which is saying like don't do the things that are forbidden, and uh or I'm sorry, that's wrong. Her amended sense of duty was basically saying like do what is required of you, unless there is some greater good that can be brought about, unless you can do something even better. Adam, you seem to be saying like she was almost putting forth like a third and her own conception of duty, but I honestly didn't see that in the text.
I think we haven't gotten there quite yet, but
Okay.
yeah, like
Because
how
I'm at
about, like,
almost like a conclusion.
like what about like in the conclusion here? I mean,
Yeah.
there are a few lines here that I didn't like
Okay.
as much.
I have questions about the very end of it too.
Yeah, I think there are some things maybe hinted once we get to them here, but maybe I was wrong. But I guess I don't know. Do you not have like a sense that like there is some sort of like kind of minimum standard of duty here where it's like, okay,
Yeah.
what about if we continue to look at the example that we just did, but like what if there's like a trivial good that would be accomplished by adhering to one's duty, and to do otherwise is unreasonable?
To do otherwise is unreasonable. So
'Cause
are
we're- 'cause
you
we're-
saying you're trying to come up with an example that fits that? Or are you trying to
no,
yeah.
because the example you just gave there about like applying to like these different conferences, right?
Mhm.
It's like, okay, you in a sense flouted a duty that would have like that would have resulted in a very, very trivial amount of good to the world, right? So
Yeah.
seems reasonable because it would have, provided a lot of individual benefit, right?
Yeah.
But perhaps like we could imagine a scenario in which you flouted a duty that would have brought trivial good to the world,
Mhm.
but we're like, I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, so it's like it's like
actually
a nihilistic flouting of duty almost.
Well, it's just I think we at least expect people not to behave that way, right? Is that not like
like flouting duty for flouting's sake or something like that?
Yeah, almost, right?
Yeah.
Like I don't know.
Yeah, because it's like so when you encounter the person who is like flouting even a trivial duty, and they are doing it like the end of their like the reason why they're doing it is just like because they enjoy the flouting of it almost.
No, but it's or it's like I don't know. I've encountered people like this before. Have you? I mean, where it's just like, someone just like steps in the front of like a line, to board the plane, and it's like it's like why'd you do this? You know what I mean? Well, it's just like,
yeah,
I don't know, because I felt like it. You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's like, is it because you wanted to get on the plane faster? It's like, no, I just didn't feel like, following the rules. There are some people who just like would prefer not to adhere to a certain duty. But it's not in a reasonable sense that it would bring about them like personal benefit. I think the boarding the plane option was bad, but I'd have to think about an example.
I know what you mean.
I'm actually struggling to. I think I missed like what this set of examples relates back to.
I was just going to comment on that, Giffen, because I was thinking like I like the example, and then I'm thinking like I'm not sure that Wolf would be bothered by it, in the sense that her aim was supposed to show that it's not always the case that like
that's exactly it.
Do you know what I mean? So I'm like, I'm not sure that she would be bothered by this example.
No, but I mean, like, the idea that there, like, we were talking about there being like a hard line, right?
Yeah.
It's like she's saying ultimately there is no hard line.
It's more of a dotted line, she says.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, like, couldn't the hard line be like, you know, nothing that is, you know, both unreasonable.
Oh, I
And-
see. You're trying to
and
keep the hard line, but
keep the hard
define it
line.
differently.
Yeah, but define it differently. Exactly.
I
Yeah,
understand.
that's definitely kind of what I'm inclined towards.
Yeah,
Whenever I was
yeah.
complaining, well, not critiquing, let's say earlier, her conception, I was like,
We'll say I
think-
was complaining.
fine.
Like, I mean, like, would you expect that of either of us though? Like, if we like
Yeah.
did something to
yeah.
kind of like flout a duty that just
Okay,
seemed like
so now-
trivial on
yeah,
its
yeah,
face,
I
but
get it.
at the same time, we really couldn't provide any reason that you found reasonable. It was like, or even one that might seem reasonable to
Okay.
us. You know what I mean?
So okay, can I rephrase your challenge is, okay, you're saying, okay, Wolf, like I grant you that like our current line of duty isn't like exactly matching into like considered intuitions. So here's my new line of duty. And I'm gonna
Yeah.
say that I'm still gonna endorse a hard line, and I'm gonna say that what is below the line of this new duty is that something be violating a duty in the sense that it's bad for the world and it's unreasonable.
Yeah.
And if you stipulate that, then you cannot present me with a case in which you can do something that is below that line, but in some sense still be morally decent.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
Okay. I understand your critique now. So the challenge for you, here's what would falsify your claim, is an example of something that violates a duty and is unreasonable. I'm trying to channel like my inner wolf here. I almost wonder if she's gonna say like, because I like the proposal. I'm just thinking about how she would come back at it. I almost wonder if she would say it's unfair to define like reasonableness into the definition, given that reasonableness itself seems to be like the root for exceptions. So you've almost like made it a tautology by saying like, show me something that's morally reasonable that I have defined as unreasonable, right? Which like no one can do. But then I almost think Wolf's gonna say like, well, haven't you just decreed then that like you're almost saying like what is like your duty and reasonable is your reasonable duty? And she's gonna be like, well, yeah, but I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking like, you know what I mean? I'm just kind of trying to think about how she might respond to that.
Yeah, I know. I definitely kind of get that point there, but I think that just indicates that reasonable has to be a part of the equation
Yeah.
for assessing these things. So it's
Okay.
like,
Okay.
so
Where?
like kind of like by what you just said right there, it's like, okay, if we're talking about reason when it comes to, you know, I guess this is like moral duties.
Mhm.
Yeah, if someone's like acting unreasonable, then you know,
Yeah,
it's,
So you're.
I'm
I'm sorry, Giffen.
I was going to say, I wasn't 100% sure if I was following. So you basically like, you would draw a line where like the line is defined by reasonableness.
And it's a
opposed-
2-condition thing, right?
yeah, it is a 2-condition thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like they would have to both flout a duty, and not be reasonable. Like they would
I'm
have
sorry,
to be,
what is, I thought we were discussing the line of duty.
This is Adam's line of duty.
yes. Like I'm saying, like she's saying there's no hard line, and I'm saying like, okay, like I'm just kind of throwing this out there, but like she's incorporated like this concept of like reasonableness for why
Yeah.
someone could flout it.
Mhm.
And I'm saying like, okay, fine.
Mhm.
Like that seems to make sense where there are reasonable circumstances where one could flout one's duty. But what if one is like is just unreasonable?
So
and flouts one's duty?
what Adam's doing, or at least I take him to be doing, is like, okay, Wolf had a hard line at like a certain level.
Mhm.
And there are some cases like kind of right below the line where it seems reasonable to do stuff that still violates duties. And Adam
Yeah.
is saying like, instead of perforating that line, why don't we just drop the line a little bit to like include those things in like the permissible category?
Yeah, that's what I thought was being discussed, but I think I got confused with some of the language of the conditions. But yeah, no, I think that's kind of like, I think, more in line with my intuition.
Yeah.
Like yeah, I'll just agree.
So below that, where would you win? Okay. Yeah.
Like I want to think of like a good example for this actually that would kind of more illustrate my point, because
Yeah,
it
I'm
can't
trying to
because
think of it.
it can't be, because it's gotta be like a trivial one as well. So like you're
Yeah.
flouting like a trivial duty,
Yeah.
but it ultimately doesn't. It's not a reasonable thing to do.
So what about this?
I mean, we can.
Well, what about like okay, so let's stick with your airport example. I like that. So like what if you can what if you can lie about your, like, okay, so you violate like a small duty. There's no, let's pretend there's no like legal consequences to this or whatever, but like you just lie and say you're a veteran or something. Like they don't check that shit. You know what I mean? Like all veterans board the plane now or whatever. I mean, I guess I don't know.
Put on your hat.
Actually. Yeah, exactly. Dons like a a camo hat and like walks on, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Confederate cap.
but it's like I get the intuition that that's like extremely unreasonable to do, given that like, okay, you were like seated, you've now lied to be like seated but just in like a different location, and the plane's gonna take off at the same time. Like let's pretend it was assigned seats, you know what I mean? So you're not getting like a better seat, you're not getting like a window seat, you're not getting an aisle. So there's like literally no conceivable reason to do this other than like this weird desire to like get on the plane first, right?
Yeah.
So Adam's gonna like point to this and be like, so Adam's basically gonna point to my example and be like, I can't think of, like, that's obviously morally undecent, or indecent rather. So like Adam's challenge then is to give an example where we get the intuition that someone could be morally decent and violate both of those categories, the unreasonableness and the violation of duty. So the flip side of like what I just said.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I got you now.
Or even
Right.
like the office hour example, like say there wasn't some famous philosopher in town, but in
Mhm.
reality, like you just wanted to go for a bike ride.
Yeah.
So, you just skip your, you flout your duty to
Yeah.
attend one's office hours, but just go for a bike ride. And it's like,
Yeah.
when pressed on this, you're just like, I wanted to go for a bike ride, right? Like there's not,
Mhm.
So it's like, it's not a reasonable flouting of one's duties,
Yeah. I almost wonder if, like, I don't dislike it at all, but I'm almost wondering if like all we're doing is kind of like pushing the question back a level to be like, well, is it reasonable to like want to, is it like, then the question just becomes like, is it reasonable to want to bike more than go to your office hours? You know what I mean? And like, I feel like we're going to get a lot of cases where like on those really borderline ones where some people like, I don't know, it's like I kind of have mixed intuitions about that. Like, I don't know, like what if no one typically comes to your office hours? Like what if this is your only opportunity to bike that day or something?
And the weather's been shitty, and it's a really great day.
Yeah,
that.
Sure. So suddenly it becomes reasonable, right? Like you're able to like suddenly, provide reasons
Mhm.
for why you did what you did. But say people do come to your office hours,
yeah,
and you just went biking. Like
then it was unreasonable.
Then
Yeah.
it was unreasonable.
Yeah, it's not that I disagree, it's that I'm almost like, I don't know, I'd have to think about, I mean, I like the proposal. It just seems like I don't know there. So, okay, I'm just trying to think this through, right? Okay. So when we were first talking about like the common sense duty, right? Like there are these things that like morality requires of you, right? Wolf implied that like, okay, the reason why that seems intuitive is it seems like moral duties, if they're going to exist, should be like these moral duties should be like these defined like lines, like you can't cross this line, right? Like that's what they're like here for, right?
Mhm.
And there's some, she didn't say this exactly, but it seems to me like there's some sort of like explanatory power um, going on with that, where it's like when you find out that something's a duty, it's supposed to like explain why you should do it or something like that, right? And I guess I'm wondering, well, then
I
so
kind of read this actually from her writing a little bit, where she was talking about like more or less reasonable. She
yeah,
was like, she kind of did bring that up, where she was saying like,
yeah,
okay, there's like a famous philosopher in town. Someone might find that maybe a little less reasonable for
mm,
skipping office hours than if like she had gotten into a car accident, right?
mm.
Where it's like, or no, or if I'm sorry, not a car accident, because that's not something she actively like chose. Maybe like ran into like a burning building.
Was
It's
there-
quite unreasonable if she crashes a car
Yeah.
into a
No,
bus.
no, but I mean like, okay, like there are different reasons
Mm.
for flouting one's duties, and some can be more reasonable than others, right? But like once we deem something like unreasonable, then I mean, I think from like
Mm.
any student's perspective that intended to go to that like
Yeah.
office hours would actually consider that person to be like probably like not a very moral person. Actually, like say you had shown up to go to the office hours, right?
Yeah.
And they just weren't there.
Yeah.
And like, why weren't they here? You ask, like, oh, they just went biking. You're like, what?
Yeah,
They went
yeah.
on a bike ride. Like that doesn't seem like a reasonable
Mhm.
like flouting of one's duty. So I
And
think
then,
that's kind of
but
where I would draw
yeah.
that line.
And then you're gonna
So-
say like, but if you rejigger the details of the example to be like, well, it's like their doctor said that it's very important for them to bike, and this was their only opportunity that day. Well, then you begin to like understand it more.
Yeah, then it becomes reasonable.
Okay,
So-
so I knew that I was like recognizing what you were talking about. So this you're reminding me of like it kind of seems like your remember she talks about like the golden mean.
Yeah.
It kind of seems like you're pointing to that idea in some sense. Where like, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, this okay. So I'm just trying to think of like what she would say to that, and I wonder if she's going to go back to like section 2 where she talks about how like no such ranking is possible, like the incommensurability idea. Because I think when we all were thinking about that example, we were like ranking the idea that you exercising for your health like overrode the duty to like hold office hours, right? So I'm just trying to think about like I think that it's reason I'm gonna say it's reasonable. I think that she would probably come back at you with like something about section 2, how no such ranking of those values is possible. Do you think that that's at least like what she would say?
She might go that route, but I just feel like that would be like a very weak response. You know what I mean? Like if you were one of those students who had kind of like made this assessment
Yeah.
of kind of crossing a line at that point, and then it's like, well, like, are you really there to decide like ultimately
Yeah.
like how you would either value like how this would benefit her individually and how this would benefit all of you and the world at large? And it's like, well, like I don't know. I certainly would think that like she has crossed like that line of moral duty at the very least at that point.
Yeah.
Like from my perspective as the student. So
Yeah. I'm just trying to think about like I'm trying to think about like how this case would handle disagreement. You know what I mean? Because like she seemed to imply that like a virtue of duty, like the hard lined kind of duty, is that like there can be no disagreement about it, right? Because it's like your duty is your
Social
duty.
element, right? Like I can judge others for failing. That's what you mean?
Yeah, and I'm wondering like, I'm like stick with the example like, like you're just kind of watching this from a third person perspective, right? Like all the details of this case. So it's like the professor thinks that what they did is reasonable and the student thinks that what they did is unreasonable. Like I don't know
But
how.
that's what I kind of mean though. Like that's why like my whole issue with like this reasonableness
Yeah.
kind of like being inserted in the first place, because that's why I was trying to at least distinguish between like reasonable and unreasonable.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
because like I don't know. I mean, we already saw that with your kind of BMW example the other podcast, where it's like I think you are flouting certain duties to the world,
Yeah.
right, as an individual,
Yeah.
which you and I both viewed as like reasonable, but Giffen a little more unreasonable. Like Giffen was kind of like, I'm not sure how reasonable that is actually. Like you do have an effect on the world.
Like very mild condemnation.
Yeah. So it's like yes, you want to drive a cool car. Yes, there is the convenience factor because that's the current car you have. Yes, this is the situation you're in, but at the same time, like you are flouting a duty, and I'm not sure it's reasonable.
Yeah.
Right. So, and you and I thought it was reasonable. So I don't. That's why the whole reasonableness thing for me, I think we shouldn't focus too much on whether it is reasonable or not, because different people are going to make different moral judgments based on whether they find it reasonable or not.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying?
No, I do. I'd honestly just have to like think about this a little bit more.
I'm really curious what the class has to say.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I don't even know if it's a good thought on my part. This is just kind of what when I reached the end, this was kind of some of the stuff that I was thinking about.
Yeah.
So.
It's completely fair. If she's going to kind of like mostly discuss like intuition related things, I think it's totally appropriate for us to kind of see where they do and do not map on.
I think her points are good though. I mean, she's right. Like her two examples, like, flouting each duty in each example, like it's reasonable, definitely reasonable. And I totally understand the point she's making there, where there isn't a hard line in that sense. I'm just wondering, can we still preserve some hard line?
Can we use a different hard line?
Yeah, you're almost just like buying her entire argument and then just like concluding something different.
Yeah,
you're just saying you're right. So why don't we just like lower the line to include what's not violating a duty, or like what's in conformity with duty and reasonable then?
Yeah, and then she's kind of like, I want to keep this dotted line duty currently. So that's
why I think I just realized like, okay, maybe she does that because she views. I don't remember where she has this remark, but remember she has that remark where she says like there's like a difference between what is reasonable and what is moral. So maybe like the whole reason why she wouldn't be amenable to like Adam's suggestion is not because it's like it doesn't make sense, but because like, and she just doesn't get into this in this paper, but like because there's some like distinct difference between what is reasonable and what is moral. So therefore like Adam's violating some sort of like incommensurability issue by matching those two. You know what I mean? I'm just trying to think like that seems where she might go with it.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky because like I definitely know what you're saying there, because she does say they're kind of on two different axes. But at the same time, like this kind of all goes back to like what is the minimum, like we're talking about like this moral kind of, or this line of duty. It's like, okay, if it's a hard line, if you dip beneath that line, then there is, I guess, some room for someone to think you're maybe not a moral person, or at least in that instance.
Yeah.
So she's saying that's not always true, because it can be reasonable that one flouts their duty and falls beneath that line. But I feel like there is some entanglement there between reason and morality at that point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also I suspected that Giffen would be more in line with sort of like the hardliners reply in like another way, which is to say, and I kind of think that like this is where I would have initially started from, like when reading this stuff, is like why not just say like, well, yeah, like we go below the line of duty all the time, and it's just like there's almost a way to like bite the bullet and just say like, yeah, like we don't do that all the time, but don't just like say that it's reasonable to do that. Why not just like accept the conclusion essentially and be like, yeah, we act immorally.
I'm weak-willed. Right?
Yeah,
like that.
Like why not just say like, okay, yes, like duty is. Oh, that's actually kind of where she. like, okay, so first of all, am I kind of trying to channel you correctly, Giffen? Like that is something you would want to say?
That is an appropriate channeling of Giffen.
I remember that's where she ends the essay with. This is like the final couple paragraphs. Because she says, for we can, if we like, make an unconditional commitment to doing our amended or unamended duty. We can wed ourselves to duty absolutely, in the sense that we can simply adopt the practice of taking, quote, it's one's duty to do X to constitute a decisive reason for doing X with no exceptions allowed. There are two things to be said in support of this practice. So the first one is that she kind of points this like slippery slope. So the idea is that, like, okay, if you really do think that like we just fail our obligations all the time, like why would we stop, essentially? So the idea is like, well, if you do think that you just like violate duties all the time and it's just not that big of a deal because like we always do it, like why not just violate one more duty then, like as a treat, like, you know,
for violation's sake.
Yeah, exactly. And that I think like her idea of like a perforated line is supposed to be like kind of a psychologically advantageous thing in some sense, right? Where it's like, you know, well, there are reasonable cases where you can go beneath that, and that's where Adam's going to say, sure, just don't do unreasonable cases of going below that line.
Yeah, and like reasonable to oneself and to others to an extent. I don't think more about this, but like if I flouted a duty to you, you would demand an explanation, like at least like in an interpersonal sense, right? Like I would have to give something reasonable. Otherwise, like I would probably be viewed as a less moral individual in your eyes.
In the sense that like once you explain, this goes back to her point about like decisive moral reasons, like in the sense that once you gave me the explanation, I should see it as like maybe not decisive, but like reasons that made your action sort of like understandable in some sense.
Exactly. It's like, you know, you were supposed to hop on this call today at 6:30, but like I didn't respond to anybody. And it's like I wonder what happened to him, right? Like did he get like injured? Like, you know, was he in a car accident? Like what happened? And it's just like, honestly, just felt like watching the NFL game. like
without letting you know.
Without letting anybody know. They'd be like, okay, reasonable be damned to him, right? Like, it might have been reasonable enough to the individual, but like certainly anybody who like viewed that situation from like a third person perspective would say it's actually quite unreasonable.
Yeah.
And like he both flouted his duty and for something unreasonable. So
this actually goes to like and in a way, so it's not the concept of like decisive moral duty, but it's something close to that. Like it's like going to meet some like decisively reasonable standard. Something like that. Actually, that kind of, I think that's a good place to wrap up, because that also begins to talk about like something that I said I learned from class from last semester, but I don't know that it's particularly germane to this episode, also because I might write one of my first papers on it. So I don't know that it's wise necessarily if I don't end up writing the paper to like vomit my ill-formed ideas on air. So
fair.
So all right. You're good to wrap up with this. I would say I'm the most ambivalent about this paper of the three we've read so far.
I have mixed feelings too.
No, that's 100% fair.
Yeah, I definitely am the most ambivalent. I'm curious to hear, like, because so far the ordering of the papers has been excellent. So now I'm now I'm like hungry for the next paper too, to like shed a bit more light on some of these questions.
I thought this definitely expanded on a lot of the ideas in Moral Saints, where it's just like, okay, yes, we're talking about often competing values on different axes, often incommensurable ones. Like,
granting like, that, let's talk about duty.
Duty, kind of like benefit to oneself, to the world. How are we supposed to kind of like, assess these or compare them? So
Yeah, definitely. All right, yeah, let's wrap up this episode. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I hope they'll continue to listen to the series and tune in next time. If you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people, and so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts, like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy. And now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. Adam and Giffen accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways, it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffen is also one of my oldest friends. We've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffen studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. And he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. With all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.